At my wedding, my son and his wife laughed at my new bride in front of 400 guests. They called her a beggar. They called her a senile old woman who smelled like fertilizer. They mocked her cheap dress and told me I had finally lost my mind. My son Preston stood on the stage I built with my own hands and turned the happiest day of my life into a comedy show for his rich friends. He thought I was weak. He thought I was just a retired carpenter who did not understand how the world worked anymore. He did not know that the woman standing next to me in that $20 dress was not just a gardener. He did not know she could buy and sell his entire life with a single phone call. When the black SUVs finally pulled up and the truth came out, the look on his face was worth every single tear I swallowed that day. Before I tell you how my gardener wife turned out to be the hidden billionaire of Chicago, and how we taught my ungrateful family a lesson they will never forget, please hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you believe that respect is something you earn, not something you inherit. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Now let me take you back to the moment everything fell apart. I am Henry Sterling. For 50 years I worked with wood. My hands are rough. They are covered in calluses and scars from chisels and saws. I built half the houses in Oak Park from the ground up. I know how to spot rot before it breaks the beam. I know how to find the termite hidden deep in the wall. But on the afternoon of my 70th birthday, which was also my wedding day, I realized I had missed the rot growing in my own family. The backyard of my house was supposed to be a sanctuary. I had spent weeks sanding the deck, making sure the grain of the oak looked perfect for Beatrice. Bea wanted something simple. She is a woman of the earth. She loves soil and roses and honest work. She told me she did not need a big party. But my son Preston insisted. He said he wanted to honor me. He said he wanted to invite his business partners to see where he came from. I thought he was finally showing pride in his father. I was wrong. He just wanted an audience for his cruelty. I stood under the white archway holding Bea's hand. Her hand was small and warm. She was wearing a simple floral dress she bought at a thrift store. To me, she looked like an angel. She looked like the peace I had been searching for since my first wife passed away 10 years ago. But then the microphone screeched. Preston walked onto the stage. He was wearing a suit that cost more than my first truck. He held a glass of champagne and his eyes were glassy. He was not drunk on alcohol. He was drunk on arrogance. The crowd went silent. These were his friends, bankers, investors, people who never held a hammer in their lives. Preston tapped the microphone and smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of a shark. He said, "Welcome, everyone. We are gathered here today to celebrate the fact that my father, Henry, has finally decided to get a live-in nurse." The crowd erupted in laughter. A cold shiver went down my spine. I squeezed Bea's hand. She did not flinch. She just stared straight ahead with a calmness that I could not understand. Preston continued. He pointed his glass at us. He said, "Look at them, folks. True love is beautiful, isn't it? Or maybe it is just desperation. Dad, I know you are lonely, but did you have to pick someone who looks like she just finished mowing the lawn?" The laughter got louder. My chest tightened. I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him that while he was busy gambling away his money on crypto and fancy cars, Bea and I were volunteering at the soup kitchen. I wanted to tell him that Bea listened to me when I talked about the old days, while he never answered my calls unless he needed money. Then his wife Tiffany stepped up. Tiffany used to be a model. She is beautiful on the outside, but inside she is hollow. She walked over to us holding a slice of wedding cake. She looked at Bee's dress with a sneer that could cut glass. Tiffany said, "Oh, honey, I am so sorry. I think you have a little dirt on your dress. Or is that just the pattern? It is hard to tell with these vintage fabrics. Is this from the Salvation Army collection?" Before I could react, Tiffany pretended to trip. It was a bad performance. She lunged forward and the slice of cake with heavy blue frosting smeared right across the front of Bee's chest. A gasp went through the crowd, but then the giggling started. Tiffany put her hand over her mouth in mock surprise. She said, "Oops, my clumsy feet. But do not worry, Bee. That dress could not have cost more than $5. I will write you a check for 10. Go buy yourself 2 of them." That was the moment. The blood rushed to my ears. I felt the same rage I used to feel when a piece of expensive wood would split because of a hidden knot. I took a step forward. My fists were clenched. I am 70 years old, but I am strong. I could have snapped Preston in half. I could have thrown Tiffany out of the house right there. But Bee stopped me. She did not yell. She did not cry. She simply placed her small hand on my forearm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. She looked up at me and whispered 2 words. "Not yet." I looked at her. Her dress was ruined. The blue frosting was staining the fabric. But her head was high. She took a napkin and calmly wiped the frosting from her collar. She looked at Tiffany, and then she looked at Preston. She did not look angry. She looked like a judge looking at a criminal. Bee turned to the crowd. The silence was heavy. Everyone was waiting for the old lady to cry. Everyone was waiting for the scene. Instead, Bee smiled. It was a terrifyingly polite smile. She said, "Thank you for the cake, Tiffany. It is very sweet. Almost as sweet as the irony of this moment." Preston laughed nervously. He shouted into the microphone, "Okay, folks, let's get back to the party. The old man needs a nap, and his lady needs a shower. DJ, play some music." The music blasted. The moment passed. But the damage was done. My heart was broken. I looked at my son and I realized I did not know him. I had raised a monster. I had worked 18-hour days sanding floors and framing roofs to pay for his college tuition. I had sacrificed my back and my knees so he could sit in an air-conditioned office. And this was my repayment? I walked Bee into the house to help her clean up. The noise of the party outside sounded like an insult. Inside the kitchen, I grabbed a towel and soaked it in warm water. My hands were shaking. I started to wipe the frosting off her dress. I felt tears stinging my eyes. I said, "I am so sorry, Bee. I will kick them out. I will tell them to leave right now. This is my house. They have no right to treat you like this." Bee took the towel from my hand. She touched my cheek. Her skin was rough like mine, the skin of a worker. She said, "Henry, listen to me. Do not kick them out. Not yet. Let them stay. Let them think they have won." I asked her why. Why would we suffer this? Bee walked over to the window. She looked out at Preston, who was smoking a cigar and laughing with his friends. She reached into her old worn-out purse. I thought she was getting a handkerchief. Instead, she pulled out a phone. It was not the cheap flip phone she usually carried. It was a sleek, black satellite phone, the kind I had only seen in movies. She dialed a number. She did not look at the buttons. She spoke in French. It was fluent and rapid. I did not understand the words, but I understood the tone. It was the tone of a foreman giving orders on a job site. It was the tone of a CEO closing a deal. She hung up and turned to me. Her eyes were different. The soft look of the gardener was gone. In its place was something sharp, something dangerous. She said, "Because Henry, if you kick them out now, they only lose a party. I want them to lose everything. I want to see who they really are when they think nobody is watching. They called me a beggar. They called you a fool. By the end of this week, they will be begging you for forgiveness. Trust me." I stood there in my kitchen, holding a dirty towel, looking at the woman I thought I knew. I had married a gardener. I had married a sweet lady who liked to plant tulips. But as I watched her stare down at my son like a hawk watching a mouse, I realized I had no idea who Beatrice really was. And for the first time that day, I wasn't afraid of my son. I was afraid for him. Outside, I heard Preston's voice booming over the music. He was shouting something about the future, about how things were going to change around here. He had no idea how right he was. The change was coming, and it was standing right next to me, wearing a stained floral dress and planning his destruction. I excused myself from the table, muttering something about needing to take my medication. The truth was that I felt like I was suffocating. The air outside was fresh, but the atmosphere around my table was toxic. Every time my son looked at me, I felt small. Every time his wife looked at Beatrice, I felt angry. I needed a moment of silence to compose myself before I did something I would regret. Like punching the groom at his own father's wedding celebration. I made my way to the pool house at the back of the property. It was a structure I had built 10 years ago, hand-laying every single brick and tile. It was solid and quiet, far enough away from the DJ and the fake laughter of the crowd. I pushed open the heavy door to the men's changing room and locked it behind me. The silence was instant. I walked over to the granite sink, gripping the cool edge of the counter until my knuckles turned white. I stared at myself in the mirror. The face staring back was old. There were deep lines etched around my eyes and mouth, maps of 70 years of hard labor and worry. My gray hair was thinning. For a second, I saw myself through Preston's eyes. Was I just a senile old fool? Was I pathetic for thinking I could find love again at this age? I splashed cold water on my face, trying to wash away the shame that was burning my skin. The water dripped from my chin onto my tie, but I didn't care. I just wanted to breathe. I reached for a paper towel, but my hand froze in midair. The sound of the outer door opening echoed off the tiled walls. I instinctively stepped back into the shadows of the shower alcove. I do not know why I hid. Maybe I was ashamed of being seen crying. Maybe I just didn't want to talk to anyone. But then I heard the voices, and my blood ran cold. It was Preston and Tiffany. They must have thought the room was empty. Finally, a break from that circus, Preston groaned. I heard the sound of a lighter flicking, followed by the long exhale of smoke. I specifically told the caterers no cheap champagne, and what do they serve? This swill tastes like vinegar. Tiffany giggled, the sound sharp and grating. "Oh, stop it, babe. It is perfect for this crowd. Did you see the dress that woman is wearing? I swear I saw a moth fly out of it when she hugged me. It smells like mothballs and manure." They both laughed. It was not the polite laughter they used outside. It was ugly. It was the sound of two people who thought they were better than everyone else. I held my breath, pressing my back against the cold tiles. I should have walked out there. I should have confronted them. But something in Preston's tone made me stay. There was an urgency in his voice that I hadn't noticed before. "So, did you get him to sign it yet?" Tiffany asked. Her voice dropped to a whisper, but in the tiled room, it was crystal clear. "Not yet," Preston hissed. He sounded frustrated. The old man is too busy making moon eyes at his peasant bride. But do not worry. I have the papers in my jacket pocket. I will get him when he is drunk enough on the toast. He trusts me. He thinks I am just helping him with estate planning. My heart hammered against my ribs. Papers? What papers? I had not asked for any estate planning. "You better hurry," Tiffany said, and I could hear the click of her heels as she paced the floor. "We do not have time, Preston. The bank called me again this morning. They are threatening to seize the condo. If they find out about the crypto leverage, you are going to prison, not just bankruptcy court." "Shut up, I know," Preston snapped. His voice was full of panic now. "That is why we need this house. This place is sitting on a gold mine. 4 acres in Oak Park? The land alone is worth $3 million. We get him to sign the power of attorney today, declaring him mentally incompetent due to his age, and we can list the property by Monday morning." I felt like I had been punched in the gut. I had to cover my mouth to stop a gasp from escaping. They were not just here to mock me. They were here to steal from me. Preston, my own son, the boy I taught to ride a bike, the boy I sat up with when he had the flu, was planning to declare me insane so he could sell my home. "But what about the old woman?" Tiffany asked. "She is legally his wife now. Won't she put up a fight?" Preston let out a cruel, dismissive snort. "Her? Please. She is a nobody. She is a broke gardener looking for a meal ticket. Once I have power of attorney, I will give her $5,000 and a bus ticket back to whatever trailer park she crawled out of. If she refuses, I will threaten to sue her for elder abuse. Who are the courts going to believe? A successful investment banker or a woman wearing a $20 dress?" They laughed again. This time, they were toasting to my destruction. They were celebrating the end of my life as I knew it. They were carving up my carcass before I was even dead. I stood there in the dark, tears streaming down my face. But they were no longer tears of shame. They were tears of mourning. I was mourning the death of the son I thought I had. That boy was gone. In his place stood a predator. I remembered the nights I worked overtime, sanding floors until my knees bled, just to pay for his private school tuition. I remembered co-signing his first loan. I remembered being so proud when he put on a suit. I realized now that the suit was just a costume. Underneath, he was rotten. Preston sighed, sounding relaxed now. "Just 2 more hours, babe. Just keep smiling. Keep pouring him drinks. Once he signs that paper, our problems are over. We sell this dump, pay off the sharks, and we still have enough left over for that trip to the Maldives." This dump. He called my home a dump. He called the house where his mother died, the house where he grew up, a dump. Every beam in this house was measured by my hands. Every nail was driven with love. This house was my life's work. "Let's go," Tiffany said. "I need another drink if I'm going to pretend to listen to another one of his boring stories about the good old days." I heard the door open and close. The silence returned, but the room felt different now. The air felt heavy. I stepped out of the shower stall. My legs felt weak, but my mind was sharper than it had been in years. I walked back to the mirror. I looked at the old man staring back at me. Yes, I had wrinkles. Yes, my hands shook sometimes. But I was not weak. and I was definitely not incompetent. I looked at my eyes. The sadness was gone. It was replaced by a cold, hard resolve. It was the look I used to have when I had to fire a dishonest worker. It was the look of a man who knows exactly what needs to be done. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my handkerchief. I dried my face. I straightened my tie. I smoothed back my hair. "You want a war, son?" I whispered to the empty room. "You want to play games with the old man? Fine. You forgot one thing, Preston. I built this house. I know where the foundations are buried, and I know how to bring the whole thing down on top of you." I turned away from the mirror. I was done crying. I was done hoping for him to change. I unlocked the door and stepped back out into the sunlight. The music was still playing. The guests were still laughing. But the Henry Sterling who walked back into that party was not the same man who had left it. The father was gone. The master builder had returned, and he was ready to demolish the rot in his foundation. No one was going to sell my home. And no one, absolutely no one, was going to hurt Beatrice. It was time to show my son that the old man still had a few tricks left in his tool belt. I walked straight toward the main table, my eyes searching for my wife, ready to start the counterattack. 3 days of silence had passed since the wedding. 3 days of peace that felt more like the calm before a hurricane. I spent those days in my workshop, sanding down an old rocking chair I had built for my late wife years ago. The repetitive motion of the sandpaper against the grain usually calmed me, but my mind was racing. I kept hearing the voices from the bathroom. I kept hearing my son planning to declare me incompetent. I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. Beatrice was quieter than usual, too. She spent hours in the garden, pruning the roses with a surgical precision I had never noticed before. She told me she was just thinking, but I knew better. She was planning. On Tuesday morning, the doorbell rang. It wasn't a polite ring. It was a desperate, insistent buzzing that echoed through the hallway. I wiped the sawdust from my hands and walked to the front door. I checked the peephole. My heart sank. It was them. I opened the door to find Preston and Tiffany standing on my porch. They looked like refugees from a fashion show. Surrounding them were 6 massive suitcases, the expensive kind with the monogrammed leather that cost more than my first car. Preston looked terrible. His eyes were red, his shirt was untucked, and he had the stubble of a man who hadn't slept. For a second, just a split second, the father in me wanted to reach out. But then I remembered the bathroom. I remembered the word dump. I remembered the plan to sell my home. I stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance. I did not invite them in. I simply asked what they were doing here. Preston dropped to his knees. It was a theatrical drop, the kind you see in bad soap operas. He grabbed my hand, his palms sweaty. He said, "Dad, oh God, Dad, it is a disaster. We have lost everything." I looked at Tiffany. She was wearing sunglasses big enough to cover half her face, and she was dabbing at her eyes with a silk handkerchief. She looked like she was waiting for a photographer to snap a picture of her grief. I asked them what happened. I kept my voice flat. I did not offer comfort. I just wanted the facts. Preston looked up at me, tears streaming down his face. He said it was the penthouse. The main water line burst in the middle of the night. It was like a tsunami, Dad. The floors are ruined. The furniture is destroyed. The mold is already growing. The insurance company says it will take 2 months to fix, and they are fighting us on the payout. We have nowhere to go. I looked at the suitcases. If their apartment was flooded, how did they manage to pack 6 pristine suitcases without getting a drop of water on them? How was Tiffany's hair perfectly blow-dried? The lie was so thin I could see right through it. They weren't homeless. They were invading. They needed to be in my house to establish residency, to make it easier to claim they were my caretakers when they filed the papers for my incompetency. I started to say no. I started to tell them that there was a perfectly good Marriott down the street and that a successful investment banker should be able to afford a suite. But then Tiffany stepped forward. She took off her sunglasses. Her eyes were not red from crying. They were clear and calculating. She placed both hands on her flat stomach. She looked at me with a vulnerability that almost made me believe her. She said, "Henry, please. We would go to a hotel, but I cannot be around the chemicals they use for cleaning. Not now. Not in my condition." My breath caught in my throat. I looked at her stomach, then at her face. I asked her what she meant. Preston stood up and put his arm around her. He smiled, a weak, trembling smile. He said, "That is the other thing we came to tell you, Dad. We were going to announce it at the wedding, but with all the drama, we didn't get a chance. You are going to be a grandfather. Tiffany is pregnant." The world stopped spinning for a moment. A grandchild. It was the one thing I had wanted for 10 years. I looked at Preston. I searched his face for the lie. Was it possible? Could this be the reason for his desperation? Maybe the debts and the schemes were just panic. Maybe he was just a scared father-to-be, trying to secure a future for his child. It is a dangerous thing, hope. It blinds you. It makes you want to believe the impossible, because the alternative is too painful to accept. Tiffany reached into her purse and pulled out a small white stick. It was a pregnancy test. 2 pink lines. She held it out to me like a peace offering. She said, "Please, Grandpa, don't make us sleep on the street. Not for us, but for the baby." I stared at the plastic stick. I didn't know then that you can buy fake positive pregnancy tests online for $20. I didn't know that this was a standard trick used by con artists to gain sympathy. All I saw was a chance at redemption. All I saw was a future where my name didn't end with me. My resolve began to crack. I looked at the empty guest rooms upstairs. I looked at the large kitchen that used to be filled with noise when Preston was a boy. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I had misunderstood the conversation in the bathroom. Maybe they were just venting. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Beatrice. She had come up behind me silently. She looked at Preston and Tiffany. She looked at the suitcases. She looked at the pregnancy test. Preston stiffened. He looked at Bea with pure disgust, but he quickly hid it behind a mask of politeness. He said, "Hello, Beatrice. Look, I know we got off on the wrong foot, but we are family. We need help." I waited for Bea to kick them out. She knew everything. I had told her about the bathroom conversation. She knew they hated her. She knew they were here to destroy us. I expected her to call security. I expected her to laugh in their faces. Instead, Bea smiled. It was that soft, gentle smile that had made me fall in love with her. She squeezed my shoulder. She said, "Henry, look at them. They are children, and they are carrying a child. You cannot turn them away." I looked at her, confused. I whispered to her, asking if she was sure. I reminded her that they were dangerous. She leaned in close to my ear, so close that her lips brushed my skin. She whispered, Let them in, Henry. It is easier to catch a snake when it is in the cage than when it is hiding in the grass. Trust me. Let them stay. Her words sent a shiver down my spine. She wasn't showing mercy. She was setting a trap. She wanted them close. She wanted them to feel safe. She wanted them to make a mistake. I turned back to my son. I took a deep breath. I told them they could stay. I told them the guest wing was open, but there were rules. No loud parties, no disrespecting Beatrice, and they had to help around the house. Preston let out a breath he had been holding. He lunged forward and hugged me. He smelled of expensive cologne and stale tobacco. He said, "Thank you, Dad. You won't regret this. I promise. I am going to be the son you deserve." He pulled away and grabbed 2 of the suitcases. He motioned for Tiffany to follow him. He said, "Come on, honey. Let's get you out of this heat. It is not good for the baby." As they walked past me into the foyer, entering the sanctuary of my home, I watched them closely. Preston thought I wasn't looking. He thought I was distracted by Bea. As he passed Tiffany, he nudged her with his elbow. He looked at her and winked. It wasn't a loving wink. It was the wink of a salesman who just closed a deal with a gullible idiot. It was a wink that said, "We got him." That wink sealed his fate. The last tiny shred of doubt I had, the last hope that maybe he truly needed help, evaporated instantly. He wasn't here to heal our relationship. He was here to bury me. I closed the front door. The heavy thud sounded like the door of a prison cell slamming shut. But they didn't realize that they weren't the wardens in this prison. They were the inmates. And they had just locked themselves in with the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Bea walked past me toward the kitchen. She didn't look at the guests. She walked with a strange confidence, her floral skirt swaying. She called out over her shoulder that she was going to make tea. She said she had a special blend for pregnant women. She said it helps with the nausea of deception. I stood alone in the hallway, listening to the wheels of the suitcases rolling over the hardwood floors I had installed 30 years ago. The sound was like thunder rolling in the distance. The enemy was inside the gates. The war had officially begun. And as I looked at the mud tracks their shoes had left on my clean floor, I made a silent vow. By the time they left this house, they would wish they had never knocked on my door. I walked toward the kitchen to join my wife, ready to play the role of the oblivious old man for just a little while longer. The invasion did not happen gradually. It happened all at once, like a dam breaking. By the time the sun rose on their first morning in my house, the air felt different. It felt thinner, tighter, as if there wasn't enough oxygen left for me and Beatrice. I woke up not to the smell of Bea's coffee and the sound of birds, but to a loud, shattering crash coming from the kitchen. My heart jumped into my throat. I threw off the covers, fearing that Preston or Tiffany had slipped on the hardwood floors. I rushed down the hallway, my bare feet slapping against the cold wood. When I skidded into the kitchen, the scene before me stopped me dead in my tracks. Tiffany was standing by the center island. She was wearing a silk robe that cost more than my first set of tools. On the floor, shattered into 100 jagged pieces, was a ceramic bowl. But it wasn't just any bowl. It was part of the set Lillian and I had bought on our honeymoon in Charleston 40 years ago. Hand-painted blue clay. Irreplaceable. Tiffany didn't look sorry. She didn't look hurt. She was holding a large black garbage bag, and with a casual swipe of her arm, she cleared the rest of the shelf. My mugs, the gravy boat we used for Thanksgiving, the plates that had held 1,000 family dinners, all of them tumbled into the trash bag with a sickening clatter. I shouted her name. My voice was hoarse with sleep and rage. I asked her what she was doing. She didn't even flinch. She looked at me over her shoulder, her eyes dull and bored. She said, "Oh, good morning, Henry. I am just doing a little decluttering. This kitchen has terrible feng shui. All this old pottery looks so dusty and, frankly, poverty-stricken. I need space for my juicer and my organic supplement powders." I walked over and grabbed the bag from her hand. My hands were shaking. I looked inside. It was a graveyard of my memories. Every chip in those plates had a story. Every stain was a memory of a meal shared with people I loved. And she called it poverty. I told her to stop. I told her she had no right to touch my things. She sighed, a long, exaggerated sound of annoyance. She said, "Preston told me you were a hoarder. Henry, listen to me. Out with the old, in with the new. You want this baby to grow up in a fresh environment, don't you? Old things carry old bacteria. You should thank me." I wanted to throw her out. I wanted to drag her and her 6 suitcases to the curb, but then I saw Preston standing in the doorway, leaning against the frame, drinking coffee from a paper cup, because apparently my mugs weren't good enough for him either. He was watching me. He was waiting for me to explode. He was waiting for the proof that I was unstable, that I was an angry old man who couldn't handle change. I swallowed the scream that was building in my chest. I remembered B's words. Let them think they have won. I carefully set the bag down. I picked up one surviving saucer from the counter. I held it tight, feeling the cool ceramic against my palm. I told her fine, but do not touch the rest of the house. I retreated. It was a cowardly move, or so it felt. I walked away from the kitchen, clutching that saucer like a lifeline. I needed a sanctuary. I needed a place where I was still the master of my domain. I headed for my study at the end of the hall. That room was my holy ground. It was where I drew the blueprints for this house. It was where I kept my drafting table, my books on architecture, and my collection of antique levels. It was the one place that still smelled like cedar and tobacco, the smell of my life. But when I reached the door, I couldn't open it. There was a strange humming sound coming from inside. I pushed the handle, and the door swung open to reveal a nightmare. My heavy oak desk, the desk I had built with my own hands from a fallen tree on this property, was gone. Or rather, it was buried. It was covered in ring lights, tripods, and piles of clothes. My drafting chair was pushed into the corner, used as a rack for bright, neon spandex outfits. The bookshelves, which held my first editions and my photo albums, were now draped with green fabric. Tiffany was not in there, but her presence was everywhere. She had turned my study, my quiet place of reflection, into a studio for selling cheap clothes on the internet. I walked over to the corner. My blueprints, the original drawings of the Oak Park Library I helped build in the 80s, were on the floor. There was a shoe print, a high heel mark, right in the center of the drawing. I felt a hand on my back. It was Preston. He had followed me. He said, "Yeah, sorry about that, Dad. Tiffany needs a workspace. Her online boutique is really taking off, and the lighting in here is the best in the house. Plus, let's be honest, you haven't used this room for work in years. You are retired. You don't need an office to nap in." I looked at the shoe print on my life's work. I looked at my son. He didn't see a study. He saw wasted square footage. He didn't see my legacy. He saw real estate. I asked him why he didn't ask me first. He shrugged. He said, "We figured you wouldn't mind helping the family. Unless, of course, you don't want Tiffany to succeed. Unless you don't want to support your grandchild." There it was again. The baby card. The weapon they used to silence every objection. I walked out of the study. I couldn't look at it. I felt like a stranger in my own home. I felt like a ghost haunting a house that already belonged to someone else. I went to the living room to sit down, to just watch the news and try to calm my racing heart. I picked up the remote control. I pressed the power button. Nothing happened. I pressed it again. The screen remained black. I walked over to the thermostat on the wall because the house felt suddenly freezing. I tried to adjust the temperature. The digital screen flashed red. Locked. Enter PIN. I stared at the screen. I had never put a pin on my thermostat. I heard a chuckle behind me. Preston was sitting on the sofa, typing on his phone. He didn't even look up. He said, "Oh, don't bother with that, Dad. I upgraded the system this morning. I installed the new smart home hub. Everything is controlled by the app now. The TV, the lights, the heat, the locks." I asked him for the password. He finally looked up, and his smile was patronizing, the kind of smile you give a toddler who asks to drive the car. He said, "Dad, come on. It is too complicated. You will just mess up the settings again. Remember when you accidentally recorded that Spanish soap opera instead of the news? Technology just isn't your friend anymore." I told him I was perfectly capable of using a thermostat. He shook his head. He said, "It is for your own good. We don't want you turning the heat up to 90 degrees and burning the house down. You know how forgetful you are getting. If you need something changed, just ask me or Tiffany. We will handle it." I stood there, shivering in my own living room. It wasn't just about the heat. It was about control. He had stripped me of my ability to regulate my own environment. He had taken my plates, he had taken my workspace, and now he had taken the very air I breathed. I looked around the room. The router lights were blinking green, but I knew if I tried to connect my old laptop, the password would be changed. I was offline. I was disconnected. I was isolated. Beatrice walked into the room then. She was carrying 2 mugs of tea. She saw me standing by the thermostat, my shoulders slumped. She saw Preston smirking on the couch. She walked over to me and handed me a mug. Her fingers brushed mine, warm and steady. She didn't say a word to Preston. She just looked at the thermostat, then looked at me. Her eyes were clear. "Patience," they said. "Let him build his walls. Walls can be torn down." I took the tea. It was hot. It was real. It was the only thing in that moment that felt like it belonged to me. I sat down in the armchair, the only piece of furniture Tiffany hadn't covered in a throw blanket yet. I sipped the tea and watched my son scrolling on his phone, controlling my lights, controlling my locks, thinking he controlled me. He didn't know that every insult, every thrown-away plate, every locked door was just adding fuel to the fire that was burning inside me. He thought he was taking over territory. He didn't realize he was walking into a minefield. And I was the one holding the detonator. I just had to wait for him to take one more step. Just one more step. The sun had barely set when the invasion force arrived. These were not soldiers, but something far worse. They were Preston's potential investors, a pack of 6 men who smelled of expensive cologne and desperation. They drove cars that cost more than most people earn in a decade, and wore suits that looked sharp enough to cut skin. My dining room, the place where I used to have quiet Sunday breakfast with Lillian, and where I had shared my first coffee with Beatrice, was transformed into a stage for my son's vanity. He had rearranged the furniture, bringing in rented chairs because my handcrafted oak ones were apparently not impressive enough for high finance. But the furniture was not the worst part. The worst part was what he did to my wife. I came down the stairs buttoning my best flannel shirt, ready to sit at the table and protect my home from these vultures. But when I reached the bottom step, I froze. Beatrice was coming out of the kitchen. She wasn't wearing her floral dress or her gardening gloves. She was wearing a black dress with a white apron. It was a maid's uniform. It looked cheap and humiliating, like something bought from a costume shop. I felt the blood drain from my face. I walked over to her, my hands trembling. I asked her what in the world she was wearing. I reached out to untie the apron strings, but she stepped back. Her eyes were calm, frighteningly calm. She told me that Preston had insisted. He told her that it would help the evening flow better if there was a clear distinction between the family and the help. He said it was just a role to play to secure the funding. I turned around, ready to find my son and strangle him. But Preston was already there, flanked by two of the investors. He was laughing, holding a glass of scotch, looking at my wife like she was a prop. He saw my anger and quickly stepped in, clapping a hand on my shoulder. He whispered in my ear that I shouldn't make a scene. He said, "Do it for the baby, Dad. We need this money to secure the future for your grandson. Just play along for 3 hours." I looked at Beatrice. She gave me a barely perceptible nod. She was telling me to stand down. She was telling me that she could handle this indignity. So I swallowed my pride. It tasted like bile. I sat at the head of the table, but I felt like a prisoner. The dinner began. It was a parade of arrogance. Preston sat at the opposite end, spinning tales about his investment firm, using buzzwords like synergy and leverage. The men ate the food that Tiffany had ordered from a catering company, unaware that the woman pouring their wine could buy their entire portfolios with the loose change in her purse. Then came the introduction. A man named Miller, a heavy-set guy with a red face and wandering eyes, pointed his fork at Beatrice as she refilled his water glass. He asked who the quiet lady was. Preston didn't miss a beat. He smiled that shark smile of his. He said, "Oh, that is just Beatrice. She is my father's live-in help. She takes care of the gardening and the heavy lifting. We treat her like family, of course." The help. He called my wife, the woman I vowed to honor and cherish, the help. I started to push my chair back. The legs scraped loudly against the floor. I opened my mouth to correct him, to tell this room full of sharks that this woman was the lady of the house. But suddenly, Beatrice's hand was on my shoulder. She was refilling my glass. Her fingers dug into my muscle, a sharp, painful squeeze. It was a warning. "Silence," her grip said. "Not yet." I sank back into my chair. I watched as the dinner descended into a nightmare. The men treated her like she was invisible. They didn't say thank you. They snapped their fingers when they wanted more bread. They made jokes about how hard it is to find good domestic staff these days. Tiffany sat there, preening and giggling, enjoying seeing Beatrice reduced to a servant. The wine flowed. The men got louder. Miller, the red-faced man, was drinking heavily. He started watching Beatrice with a look that made my skin crawl. Every time she came near him, he leaned back, invading her space. It happened when she was clearing the salad plates. Miller reached out and grabbed Beatrice's wrist. It wasn't an accident. He held it, rubbing his thumb over her skin. He looked up at her with glazed, predatory eyes. He said, "You know, sweetheart, I have a big estate in the Hamptons. I could use someone with your, let's say, quiet disposition." The pay is much better than whatever this old guy is giving you." The table went quiet. Preston chuckled nervously, trying to diffuse the tension. He said, "Oh, Miller, you are a character." Miller didn't let go. He pulled Beatrice closer. He said, "I am serious. What do you say, honey? Want to upgrade your situation?" Beatrice stood frozen. She didn't pull away, likely afraid of causing the scene that I had been trying so hard to avoid. But I saw the flash of disgust in her eyes. That was it. The dam broke. I didn't care about the plan. I didn't care about the trap Beatrice was setting. I didn't care about the baby or the money or the consequences. I only cared that a filthy hand was touching my wife. I grabbed my wine glass. It was full of dark, red Cabernet. I stood up. The movement was so sudden that my chair tipped over backward with a crash. I shouted for him to get his hands off my wife. I swung my arm. The wine flew across the table in a perfect arc. It splashed directly into Miller's face, soaking his white shirt, dripping from his nose like blood. Miller gasped, blinding and sputtering. He let go of Beatrice and jumped up, knocking his chair over. The room erupted in chaos. The other men stood up, shouting. Tiffany screamed. I stood there, breathing hard, my chest heaving. I pointed a shaking finger at Miller. I told him to get out. I told him if he ever touched her again, he would need a surgeon to remove my fist from his face. Miller was wiping the wine from his eyes, cursing. He looked at Preston. He asked what kind of madhouse this was. He asked if this violent lunatic was the father Preston had mentioned. Preston turned on me. His face was purple with rage. He didn't look at the man who had harassed Beatrice. He didn't ask if she was okay. He marched over to me and shoved me. My own son shoved me in the chest. He screamed at me. He asked what was wrong with me. He said I had just ruined the biggest deal of his life. I looked at him, stunned. I told him that man was assaulting Beatrice. Preston threw his hands up. He turned to the investors, who were already gathering their coats, looking at me with a mixture of fear and pity. Preston shouted so everyone could hear. He said, "I am so sorry, gentlemen. My father, he is not himself lately. The dementia is getting worse. He gets confused. He gets aggressive. He thinks everyone is an enemy." He looked at me with cold, calculated eyes. He said, "Dad, you are embarrassing the family. You are losing your mind. Look what you did. You are hallucinating. Miller was just being friendly." I looked around the room. The investors were nodding. They bought it. They believed the lie. They saw an old man shaking with rage and assumed it was senility. They didn't see the husband defending his wife. They saw a liability. Tiffany rushed over to Miller with napkins, apologizing profusely, calling me a sick old man. Beatrice stood in the corner, wiping her wrist where Miller had grabbed her. She looked at me. There was sorrow in her eyes, but also pride. Preston grabbed my arm. His grip was painful. He hissed in my ear that this was the last straw. He said I had proven that I couldn't be trusted in polite society. He said I needed supervision. As the investors filed out, muttering about lawsuits and crazy old men, I realized what I had done. I had defended my wife, but I had walked right into Preston's trap. I had given him the ammunition he needed. He now had witnesses to my violent outburst. But as I looked at the red wine staining the white tablecloth, looking like a battlefield, I realized I didn't regret it. Not for a second. Let them think I was crazy. Let them think I was senile. Because a man who won't stand up for his wife is already dead. And I was very much alive. I shook off Preston's hand and walked over to Beatrice. I took the apron off her. I threw it on the floor. I told her loud enough for Preston to hear that she would never wear that again. Not in my house. Preston slammed the front door shut as the last car drove away. He turned to me, his eyes blazing. He said, "You are going to pay for this, Dad. You just cost me millions. You are going to sign those papers tomorrow, or I will have you committed for public endangerment." I stared him down. I told him to try it. I didn't know then that the papers were already drawn up. I didn't know that the next 24 hours would be the fight of my life. But as I walked Beatrice up the stairs, leaving my son fuming in the dining room, I knew the time for hiding was over. The war was no longer cold. It was hot, and it was burning the house down. The next morning, the house was blissfully quiet. Preston and Tiffany had left early for a brunch in the city, something about meeting a potential angel investor for Tiffany's clothing line. They left in a cloud of perfume and arrogance, assuming I was still asleep in my room. Or perhaps they just didn't care if I was awake. To them, I was just a piece of furniture that breathed, something to be maneuvered around until it could be discarded. As soon as I heard the heavy thud of Preston's car door closing and the engine fading down the driveway, I moved. I didn't go to the kitchen for coffee. I went straight to the room that used to be my sanctuary, the study they had turned into a warehouse for cheap spandex. I wasn't looking for my desk or my books this time. I was looking for paper. I had noticed something the day before when Tiffany was ranting about the cleaning lady. She had been shredding documents. Not just junk mail, but letters that looked official. I remembered the distinct red lettering on one of the envelopes she had tossed into the recycling bin before she realized I was watching. I walked into the room. It smelled of stale hairspray and desperation. I went straight to the large silver trash can in the corner. My heart was pounding in my chest, a rhythmic thumping that reminded me of a hammer hitting a nail. I felt like a thief in my own home, rummaging through garbage to find the truth about my own life. The bin was mostly filled with fabric scraps and empty Starbucks cups, but at the bottom, buried under a pile of packing slips, I found them. They were crumpled balls of paper, smoothed out and torn in places, but legible enough. I uncrumpled the first one. It was a statement from a credit card company. Platinum Elite Rewards. I didn't have a platinum card. I had a simple debit card and one credit card with a low limit that I used for emergencies and hardware store runs. I looked at the name at the top. Henry Sterling. I adjusted my glasses, hoping I was misreading it. But the name was clear. I looked at the account summary. The balance due was staggering. $50,000. I felt the blood drain from my face. $50,000. That was more money than I spent in 3 years. I scanned the transaction history. It was a roadmap of their greed. Luxury hotels in Las Vegas, high-end jewelry stores on Michigan Avenue, online gambling sites, crypto exchange transfers. They had opened a credit card in my name. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the paper. This wasn't just disrespect. This wasn't just bad behavior. This was a felony. This was identity theft. My son, the boy I had taught to always return a found wallet, had stolen my identity to fund a lifestyle he couldn't afford. I dug deeper into the trash. I found another letter. This one was from a different bank. Final notice. Overdue. We will be contacting a collection agency. I felt sick. physically sick. I sat down on the floor, surrounded by Tiffany's inventory, holding the evidence of my financial ruin. They were destroying my credit score. They were burying me in debt that would take the rest of my life to pay off. And the worst part was, they were doing it while smiling at me over the dinner table. I needed to be sure. Maybe there was a mistake. Maybe it was a joint account I had forgotten about, though I knew that was impossible. I grabbed my phone and dialed the customer service number on the back of the crumpled statement. The automated voice was cheerful, a stark contrast to the dread in my stomach. I navigated the menu, my fingers fumbling over the keypad. Finally, I got a human on the line. I told the representative my name. I told him I was holding a statement for an account I never opened. I told him there must be fraud involved. The representative, a young man named David, sounded confused. He asked me to verify my social security number. I did. He typed for a moment, the clicking of his keyboard echoing in my ear like a ticking clock. He said, "Mr. Sterling, I am looking at the file right now. This account was opened 3 months ago. The application was submitted online, but we have a signature on file for the verification documents that were mailed in." I told him I never signed anything. I told him I had never seen this card. David paused. He said, "That is strange, sir, because our notes show that you called in last week to authorize a credit limit increase. You spoke to my supervisor. You answered all the security questions correctly. Your mother's maiden name, your first pet, the high school you attended." The room spun. My mother's maiden name, my first dog, a retriever named Buster, my high school. These weren't secrets. These were things a son would know. Preston hadn't just stolen my name. He had used his knowledge of my life, the intimate details of our history, to impersonate me. I asked David who the authorized user on the account was. He said, "Let me check." Yes, here it is. A Mr. Preston Sterling. He is listed as the primary account manager. In fact, the authorization form for his access was signed and notarized. Notarized. The word hung in the air. A notary stamp requires a witness. It requires an ID check. If they had a notarized document, that meant they had either bribed a notary or, more likely, they had forged my signature so perfectly that it fooled a professional. I remembered the day Preston came over a few months ago, before the wedding, with a stack of papers. He said they were for insurance updates. He said he needed me to sign a few things to make sure I was covered for dental. I had signed them without looking closely. I trusted him. He was my son. I had signed my own death warrant. I told David to freeze the account. I told him I was recording this call and that I was declaring this debt as fraudulent. David sounded worried now. He said he would escalate this to the fraud department, but he warned me that since the authorized user was a family member and the security questions were passed, it would be a difficult investigation. He asked if I wanted to file a police report. I lowered the phone. A police report. If I filed it, Preston would go to jail, not just for a night, but for years. Wire fraud, identity theft, forgery. I looked at the crumpled paper in my hand. I thought about the baby Tiffany was carrying. Was there even a baby? Or was that just another lie to keep me compliant while they drained my life savings? The suspicion that had been gnawing at me for days suddenly transformed into something else. It turned into cold, hard fear. If they were willing to steal $50,000, if they were willing to forge legal documents, what else were they willing to do? I remembered the medicine Tiffany gave me every night. I remembered how insistent Preston was about the power of attorney papers. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were accelerating the process. They were stripping me of my assets, my credibility, and my legal rights. Once they had the power of attorney, they wouldn't need to forge signatures anymore. They could legally sell the house, empty my retirement accounts, and dump me in a state-run facility where no one would listen to a senile old man. I hung up the phone. I didn't file the police report. Not yet. Beatrice was right. If I called the police now, Preston would claim I was confused. He would show the papers I had signed blindly. He would claim he was managing my finances because I was mentally slipping. It would be his word against mine, and he had the patience of a saint, while I had the temper of a madman, as proven at the dinner party. I needed more. I needed undeniable proof. I folded the credit card statement carefully and put it in my pocket. I looked around the room. It didn't look like a messy studio anymore. It looked like a crime scene. Every piece of paper, every computer file, every lie was a weapon they were manufacturing to use against me. I stood up. My knees popped, but my legs felt steady. The fear was still there, but it was being pushed down by a survival instinct I hadn't felt since I was working on high-rise scaffolding in the windy winters of Chicago. You don't look down when you are on the edge. You look at the work. You focus on the next step. I walked out of the study. I needed to find Beatrice. I needed to tell her that this wasn't just a family squabble. We were living with criminals. And we needed to strike back before they realized I knew the truth. As I walked down the hallway, I passed the mirror in the foyer. I didn't see a victim. I saw a man who was about to dismantle his son's life, brick by brick, just like I had built it. And this time, I wouldn't leave a single stone standing. I thought the credit card fraud was the bottom of the barrel, but I was wrong. Money can be recovered. Credit scores can be fixed. But your mind, your sanity, that is something that once it cracks, you can never truly glue it back together. And that was their next target. They did not just want my money anymore. They wanted me to believe I did not deserve to have it, because I was too broken to manage it. It started with the small things. I have put my truck keys in the same ceramic bowl by the front door for 40 years. It is a habit, like breathing. But on Wednesday morning, the bowl was empty. I searched the kitchen. I searched my pockets. I began to sweat, a cold, prickly heat on the back of my neck. I asked Tiffany if she had seen them. She was sitting at the island, eating a grapefruit with a silver spoon. She looked at me with pity. She said, "Oh, Henry, not again. You left them in the refrigerator. I saw them there when I got the milk." I walked to the fridge. There, on the middle shelf next to the carton of eggs, were my keys. I stared at them. I had no memory of putting them there. My hand shook as I reached for the cold metal. I thought maybe I was distracted. Maybe I was tired. But then it happened with my medication. I take a pill for my blood pressure every morning at 8. I keep the bottle on the nightstand. Thursday morning, the bottle was gone. I tore the room apart. I checked the bathroom. I checked the floor. Nothing. Panic started to rise in my chest. My heart was racing, which is exactly what the pills were supposed to prevent. Preston walked in while I was on my hands and knees looking under the bed. He asked what I was doing. When I told him, he sighed. It was a long, heavy sigh of a burdened caregiver. He walked straight to the bathroom, opened the medicine cabinet, and pointed to the top shelf. He said, "They are right here, Dad. You put them next to the shaving cream. You looked right at them 5 minutes ago. Don't you remember?" I looked at the bottle. I could have sworn I checked that shelf. I felt a wave of dizziness. Was I going blind? Was my brain skipping beats? I swallowed the pill without water, the bitter taste sticking in my throat. I looked at my son, and for the first time, I felt a deep, terrifying vulnerability. I asked him if I was getting bad. He didn't answer. He just patted my shoulder and walked away, leaving the heavy silence to answer for him. By Friday afternoon, the house felt like a maze I couldn't navigate. The clocks seemed wrong. I would look at the microwave and it would say noon, but the grandfather clock in the hall would chime 2. I would wake up from a nap thinking it was dawn, only to find out it was dusk. I felt unmoored in time. I felt like the foundation of my reality was shifting sand. Then came the final blow. Preston came into the living room where I was staring at the television, afraid to touch the remote in case I broke something else. He had a man with him. The man was young, wearing a suit that was a little too shiny and a tie that was a little too loud. He was carrying a leather briefcase. Preston turned off the TV. He sat down on the coffee table right in front of me, invading my personal space. He said, "Dad, Tiffany and I are worried. The keys, the pills, the outbursts at dinner. We think it is time to get a professional opinion. This is Dr. Lowe. He is a specialist in geriatric cognitive decline. He is doing a house call as a favor to me." I looked at Dr. Lowe. He didn't look like a doctor. He looked like the guy Preston used to play poker with in the garage years ago. He smelled faintly of peppermint and stale beer. But I was so beaten down, so confused by the last few days that I didn't question it. I just wanted to know if I was crazy. Dr. Lowe opened his briefcase. He pulled out a clipboard. He didn't use a stethoscope. He didn't check my eyes. He just started asking questions. Fast questions. Confusing questions. He asked me to count backward from 100 by sevens. I started. 93, 86, 79. But then Tiffany walked into the room and dropped a metal tray of tea on the table with a loud clang. I lost my count. I stuttered. Dr. Lowe made a mark on his paper. He shook his head. He asked me what year it was. I said 2024. He asked me who the president was. I answered. Then he asked me to recall the 3 words he had said at the beginning of the exam. I froze. Had he said 3 words? I couldn't remember. I racked my brain. Apple? Table? Penny? I looked at Preston. He was staring at the floor, shaking his head. I whispered that I didn't know. Dr. Lowe put his pen down. He looked at Preston, not me. He spoke as if I wasn't there. He said it is consistent with early onset dementia, specifically the aggressive type. The memory loss is significant. The disorientation is severe. In my professional opinion, he is no longer capable of making legal or financial decisions. He needs a guardian. Immediately. The room spun. Dementia. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. I looked at my hands. They were the same hands that could frame a roof to within a millimeter. They were the same hands that could feel the difference between oak and pine with a single touch. But now, according to this man, the brain controlling them was rotting. Preston covered his face with his hands. He made a sound like he was crying. He said, "Oh God." I knew it. I tried to deny it, but I knew it. "Okay, doctor. Thank you. I will take the burden. I am his only son. I will handle the power of attorney. I just want him to be safe." He looked at me with tears in his eyes. He said, "Don't worry, Dad. I will take care of everything. You won't have to worry about bills or the house or anything ever again. Just sign the papers and you can rest. You can just rest." I felt a tear slide down my cheek. I was broken. They had won. I was just an old man who lost his keys in the fridge. I was a burden. I stood up, my legs feeling like lead. I told them I needed to lie down. I told them to leave the papers on the table. I walked past them. I walked past the smirk that Tiffany tried to hide behind her teacup. I walked past the doctor who was already checking his watch, probably eager to get his payment. I went to my bedroom and closed the door. I didn't turn on the light. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. The darkness felt welcoming. If I was losing my mind, maybe the darkness was where I belonged. I thought about the credit card. Maybe I had opened it and forgotten. Maybe I had invited them to live here. Maybe I was the monster. The door creaked open. Soft footsteps crossed the floor. Beatrice sat down next to me. The mattress dipped under her weight. She didn't say anything at first. She just took my hand. Her hand was rough, warm, and real. I tried to pull away. I told her she should leave. I told her I was crazy. I told her she didn't want to be married to a vegetable. Beatrice didn't let go. She squeezed my hand harder. She leaned in close, her voice a fierce whisper in the dark. She said, "Look at me, Henry. Look at me right now." I turned to face her. Her eyes were adjusting to the gloom, shining with a light that cut through my fog. She said, "You are not crazy. You did not put your keys in the fridge. I watched Tiffany take them from the bowl while you were in the shower. I watched her put them next to the eggs." My breath hitched. I asked her what she meant. She continued, her voice steady and angry. "And your pills? Preston moved them. I saw him. And that clock in the hall? He turned the hands back 2 hours while you were napping. And that doctor? That isn't the doctor, Henry. That is Mickey. He used to fix transmissions at the shop on 4th Street. He lost his license for insurance fraud 3 years ago." I stared at her. The fog in my brain began to lift. The pieces started to click together. The confusion, the fear, the shame. It wasn't natural decay. It was manufactured. It was a script they had written, and they had forced me to play the lead role. I asked her why she didn't stop them. She touched my cheek. She said, "Because we needed them to think it worked. We needed them to bring in the fake doctor. We needed them to commit the fraud on record. That piece of paper Mickey just signed, that isn't a medical diagnosis. That is a confession. And I recorded the whole thing on the nanny cam I hid in the bookshelf." I felt a surge of emotion that I couldn't name. It was relief, rage, and love all mixed together. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being hunted. But I wasn't alone in the jungle. Beatrice kissed my forehead. She whispered, "You are saner than anyone in this house, Henry. You are the smartest man I know. Now wipe your eyes. Tomorrow is Friday. Tomorrow is the day they want you to sign. And tomorrow is the day we remind them who really owns this house." I took a deep breath. The air didn't feel thin anymore. It felt like oxygen. I squeezed my wife's hand back. I wasn't a senile old man. I was a carpenter. And I had a demolition job to do. The basement was cold, but it was the only place where the air felt clean. Down here, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and cedar, I was not a senile old man. I was Henry Sterling, master carpenter. I ran my hand over the workbench I had built 40 years ago. My tools were hanging on the pegboard exactly where they had always been. Preston and Tiffany had not touched this room yet. To them, it was just a dirty dungeon full of sharp objects and manual labor, things they despised. They did not know that down here, I possessed the weapons I needed to take back my life. I took my old tool belt off the hook. The leather was worn soft and stained with oil, molding perfectly to my waist. It felt like putting on armor. I selected a drill with a 1/16 of an inch bit, a chisel, and a small box of electronics I had bought from the hardware store that morning while pretending to take a walk. They were simple, motion-activated cameras, the kind people use to watch their pets. They were small, but to the untrained eye, they were invisible if you knew how to hide them. And nobody knew how to hide things in wood better than I did. I waited until 2 in the morning. The house was silent, save for the rhythmic snoring coming from the guest wing where my son and his wife were sleeping the sleep of the guiltless. I moved through the house in my socks. I knew every creak in the floorboards. I knew which step on the stairs would groan if you put weight on it. I moved like a ghost in the house I had built. My first target was the dining room. I crawled under the massive white oak table. I remembered the day I planed this wood. It was hard, unforgiving timber. I located the leg that faced the hallway and the living room entrance. Quietly, carefully, I drilled a small cavity into the intricate carving of the lion's paw at the base. The wood yielded to my drill. I inserted the tiny camera lens, securing it with a dab of wood putty that I mixed to match the stain perfectly. Within 10 minutes, the camera was part of the furniture. It would see everything. I moved to the living room. There was a large picture frame on the mantelpiece, a photo of Preston when he was 10 years old, holding a baseball bat. It was ironic. I took the frame down. With my chisel, I carved a small notch in the back of the mahogany border. I nestled the second camera there, aiming it directly at the sofa where Preston liked to sit and plot my demise. I put the frame back. The eyes of the 10-year-old boy were now watching the 35-year-old monster he had become. I worked for 3 hours. I put eyes in the kitchen cabinets. I put ears in the hallway baseboards. My hands did not shake. My mind did not wander. I was focused. I was building a trap, and the craftsmanship had to be perfect. When I was finished, I retreated to the basement and set up the receiving monitor behind a stack of old paint cans. The screens flickered to life. I saw the empty rooms in grainy black and white. My house was no longer just a home. It was a surveillance state. The next morning, the real test began. I was sitting in the kitchen, staring at my coffee, when Tiffany walked in. She was wearing a silk robe and that fake, bright smile that never reached her eyes. She held a small paper cup in her hand. "Good morning, Pop," she chirped. She called me Pop when she wanted to sound affectionate, but it sounded like an insult. "Time for your vitamins. And Preston says you need to take your relaxant. You were shouting in your sleep again last night." I wasn't shouting. I had slept soundly for the first time in days, knowing that the trap was set. But I nodded. I played the part. I made my hands tremble as I reached for the cup. Inside was a large, white pill. It wasn't a vitamin. It was the sedative they had been feeding me to make me foggy and compliant. I put the pill in my mouth. Tiffany watched me like a hawk. She stood there, arms crossed, waiting for the swallow. I moved the pill under my tongue, a trick I had learned from watching prison movies. I took a big gulp of water and swallowed the liquid loudly. I opened my mouth to show her it was empty, lifting my tongue just enough to hide the pill beneath it. Good boy, she said. She actually patted my head. She treated me like a dog. Now, why don't you go watch your shows? Preston and I have some business to discuss. I shuffled away, keeping my head down. As soon as I was in the bathroom, I spat the pill into a tissue. It was starting to dissolve, bitter and chemical. I flushed it down the toilet and watched it swirl away. My mind stayed clear. My anger stayed sharp. I went down to the basement, locking the door behind me. I turned on the monitor. The feed from the kitchen was crisp. I saw Preston enter the room. He kissed Tiffany. They didn't look like a couple in love. They looked like accomplices. I saw them talking, but then Preston left for a meeting. Tiffany was alone. I watched her roam the house. She wasn't doing chores. She wasn't resting her pregnant body. She was bored. I switched the camera view to the sunroom. This was Beatrice's sanctuary. It was filled with orchids she had been growing for years. Some of them were rare species that took months of care to bloom. They were her pride and joy. Tiffany walked into the sunroom. She was holding a bottle of bleach from the laundry room. My stomach tightened. I leaned closer to the screen. She walked over to the prize purple orchid, the one Beatrice had named after her mother. Tiffany looked at the flower. She didn't admire it. She sneered at it. She muttered something I couldn't hear, but I could read her lips. She said, "Disgusting." Then she tipped the bottle. I watched in horror as the thick, clear liquid poured into the soil. She didn't just pour a little. She drowned the roots. She moved to the next pot, and the next. She was methodically poisoning the things my wife loved most in the world. And then she laughed. It wasn't a loud laugh. It was a soft, cruel giggle. She was enjoying it. She was enjoying the destruction. She wasn't doing this for money. She wasn't doing this to secure a future for a baby. She was doing it because she was malicious. She hated Beatrice simply for existing. She hated the beauty that Beatrice created because she was incapable of creating anything beautiful herself. I hit the record button. The hard drive hummed as it saved the file. I sat back in my old chair, my heart pounding against my ribs. I had thought this was about greed. I had thought my son was just desperate for cash. But this video proved something much darker. They were cruel. They were willing to destroy living things just for the sport of it. I looked at the image of Tiffany walking away, leaving the bleach bottle hidden behind a fern, wiping her hands as if she had just done a good day's work. I felt a coldness settle in my chest. It was the death of the last hesitation I had. A man who steals money is a criminal. But a person who kills flowers for fun? That is a sociopath. I saved the clip and named it Evidence Number 1. I looked at my hands. They were clenched into fists. I wasn't going to fix the orchids. I couldn't. They were already dead. But I was going to make sure that the weed that had taken root in my family was pulled out by the roots. I checked the other cameras. The house was watching. And I was no longer the prey. I was the hunter. And the hunt had just begun. The smell of sawdust and motor oil has always been my sanctuary. It is the scent of honest work, of things built with hands and sweat, not with lies and signatures on stolen paper. I sat on my old stool in the corner of the garage, the one with the cracked leather seat that molded perfectly to my tired bones. My hands, rough and scarred from 50 years of guiding chisels and saws, held the iPad Preston had mocked me for owning. He thought I was too old to understand technology. He thought I was just a senile old man who could barely operate a television remote. But fear is a powerful teacher, and the need to protect what is yours can sharpen a man's mind faster than a whetstone sharpens a blade. The house was quiet for the first time in weeks. Preston and that viper he married, Tiffany, had gone out to some high society brunch, probably to spend money they did not have or to brag about the inheritance they thought they had already secured. They had left Bea alone. My stomach twisted with guilt. I should have been in there with her. I should have been the shield standing between her and their cruelty. But we had agreed to this plan. I needed to see what happened when the wolves were away and the sheep was left unattended. Or at least, that is what I thought I was doing. I tapped the screen, my calloused finger bringing up the live feed from the camera I had hidden in the living room inside the hollowed-out base of the antique grandfather clock. The image was crisp. There she was, Beatrice, my Bea. I expected to see her sitting in her favorite armchair, perhaps darning one of my old socks, or reading one of those paperback romance novels she bought from the thrift store for $0.25. I expected to see the woman I married, a woman of simple pleasures who found joy in the blooming of a rose or the smell of fresh bread. I wanted to see her safe, resting from the torment my son put her through. What I saw instead made the breath catch in my throat. Bea was not knitting. She was not reading. She was standing by the large oak dining table, but her posture had changed completely. The slight stoop she carried, the one I attributed to her age and years of hard work in the garden, was gone. Her back was straight as a steel rod. Her chin was lifted. The gentle, almost timid woman who flinched when Tiffany raised her voice had evaporated. In her place stood someone I did not recognize. She reached into her oversized knitting bag, the one she carried everywhere. But she did not pull out yarn. She pulled out a laptop. It was not like the cheap plastic one I used to check emails. This machine was sleek, matte black, and looked heavy. It looked industrial, military. The kind of equipment you do not buy at the local electronics store. She opened it with a practiced, fluid motion, her fingers dancing across the keyboard with a speed that made my head spin. I turned up the volume on the iPad, pressing the speaker against my ear. The silence of the living room was broken by a sharp electronic chime as a video call connected. A face appeared on her screen, though I could not see who it was from my angle. I could only hear Bea. "Guten Morgen, Herr Schmidt," she said. I nearly dropped the iPad. German. She was speaking German. And not just the clumsy phrases a tourist might know. Her voice was guttural, precise, commanding. It was the voice of someone who gave orders, not someone who took them. She listened for a moment, nodding sharply. Then she switched, effortlessly, like flipping a switch on a power saw. "Non, c'est inacceptable. Je veux voir les chiffres avant midi." French. Fluent, rapid-fire French. "No, that is unacceptable. I want to see the numbers before noon." I sat there in the dark garage, my mouth hanging open. Who was this woman? I had been married to her for 2 years. We met at the community garden. She told me she was a retired nanny. She told me she lived on a small pension. I had bought her dinner at the diner on Tuesdays because I thought she needed a hot meal. I had bought her that winter coat because I thought hers was too thin. I felt a flush of heat rise up my neck. Had I been the fool? "Listen to me closely," Bea said, switching to English now. Her tone was ice cold. It lacked all the warmth I knew. It was a voice that could cut glass. The merger with the Logicalistics Group in Hamburg needs to be finalized by Friday. I am looking at the valuation report now. 500 million is a starting point, not the final offer. Squeeze them. They are desperate, and we are not. 500 million. The number echoed in the garage, bouncing off the walls where my rusty tools hung. $500 million. I looked at the grease stains on my pants. I looked at the old Ford truck I had kept running with duct tape and prayer. My wife was discussing $500 million, while sitting at a table my son wanted to sell for scrap. She paused, listening to the person on the other end. Then she laughed. It was not her usual soft chuckle. It was a dry, dark sound. "No," she said, "I am not in New York. I am currently observing a distressed asset." She glanced around the room, her eyes landing on the pile of unpaid bills Preston had left on the counter. "I have a personal matter to attend to. A very messy, very personal matter." She stood up and paced the room. The way she moved was predatory, like a shark circling in deep water. "My lawyers," she said into the computer. "Get the team ready. The trust fund structure we discussed last year, I want it activated. But I want a clause added. A total liquidation clause." She stopped pacing and looked directly at the grandfather clock. For a second, a terrifying second, I thought she saw me. I thought she knew I was watching. But she was looking through the clock, looking at something in her mind's eye. "You asked me why I am delayed," she said to the screen. "I am teaching a lesson. There is a young man here, a very foolish, greedy young man, who thinks power comes from shouting and stealing. He thinks he can bully the weak. He thinks he can take what he has not earned." Her voice dropped an octave, becoming a low growl. "He calls me an old woman. He calls me a peasant. He thinks he is a wolf entering a sheep pen." Bea leaned closer to her laptop screen, her face illuminated by the cold blue light. "He does not realize that he has walked into the den of a lioness. He wants to talk about money? Fine. I will show him what money really is. I will show him the difference between a puddle and an ocean." She tapped a key with finality. "Prepare the foreclosure documents on his penthouse downtown. Yes, the one he thinks he owns. Buy the debt. Buy it all. I want to hold the leash. By the time I am done with Preston Sterling, he will wish he had stayed in the gutter where he belongs." She closed the laptop with a snap. The screen on my iPad went still as she sat back down, taking a deep breath. Just as quickly as it had appeared, the mask slid back into place. Her shoulders slumped slightly. The hard lines of her face softened. She reached into her bag and pulled out her knitting, placing the military laptop underneath a skein of gray wool. In seconds, she was Bea the gardener again. I lowered the iPad, my hands shaking so hard I could barely hold it. I stared at the concrete floor of the garage. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. I felt a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside me. Confusion, disbelief, but mostly a profound sense of awe. I had spent the last week agonizing over how to save us. I had lost sleep wondering how I, a retired carpenter with a limited savings account, could fight a man like my son who knew how to manipulate the system. I had felt weak. I had felt old. I had felt like I was failing her. But I was wrong. I looked at the screen one last time. Bea was humming a soft tune now, her needles clicking together rhythmically. My wife was not a victim. She was not a poor, helpless old woman who needed my protection. She was a titan. She was a force of nature disguised in cardigans and sensible shoes. And my son, my arrogant, cruel, foolish son, had just poked the most dangerous creature he could possibly imagine. A grim smile slowly spread across my face, stretching the wrinkled skin. I leaned back against the workbench. The fear that had been gripping my chest for days began to loosen. It was replaced by a new feeling: anticipation. Preston thought he was playing a game. He thought he was the player and we were the pawns. He had no idea. He had absolutely no idea that the queen was already on the board, and she was coming for his king. "God help you, son," I whispered into the quiet of the garage. "Because she certainly won't." I closed the iPad cover. I sat there for a long time, just listening to the silence, knowing that the storm was not coming. The storm was already here, sitting in my living room, knitting a scarf. I pulled my truck into the parking lot of the Rusty Spoon Diner, the gravel crunching under my tires like the shattering of old bones. It was a place stuck in time, smelling of burnt coffee and grease, the kind of place where men like me went to bury their troubles or dig up the truth. I was there to do both. Sitting in the back booth, nursing a black coffee that had gone cold, was Frank. We had served in the army together 40 years ago, and after he came home, he spent 3 decades as a private investigator cleaning up messes for people who could afford to hide them. But today, he was doing a favor for an old friend, and judging by the look on his face, it was a favor he wished he had never taken. I slid into the booth opposite him. Frank did not smile. He did not offer the usual handshake or the joke about my gray hair. He just kept his hand resting firmly on a thick manila envelope in the center of the table. His knuckles were white. The silence between us stretched tight, heavy with the things men do not say to each other until they absolutely have to. I asked him to give it to me straight. I told him I did not want sugarcoating. I told him I was a big boy who had seen enough ugly things in my life to handle one more. Frank sighed, a long, rattling sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. He slid the envelope across the laminate table. He told me that what was inside was not just bad behavior. It was not just a son being ungrateful or greedy. It was criminal. He told me to read it, but to keep my hands on the table so I would not punch a wall. I opened the clasp. The first thing I saw was a series of photographs. They were grainy, taken with a long-range lens, but I recognized the subject immediately. It was Preston. He was standing on a street corner downtown, handing a briefcase to a man I did not know. Then there were documents, bank statements, emails. But the most damning thing was a photocopy of an official letterhead from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My breath caught in my throat. I looked up at Frank, waiting for him to tell me it was a mistake. But Frank just shook his head. He told me that my son was not an investor. He was not a financial genius. He was running a Ponzi scheme. A classic, dirty, low-down pyramid scam. He had been taking money from retirees, from teachers, from small business owners, promising them massive returns on a cryptocurrency algorithm that did not exist. He was paying the old investors with the new money, skimming the top for his penthouse, his designer suits, and Tiffany's jewelry. But the house of cards had collapsed. Frank pointed to the date on the FBI letter. They were building a case. Indictments were coming down the pipeline. Preston knew it. He was drowning, and he was thrashing around looking for anything that could keep him afloat for just a few more days. That was where I came in. That was where my house came in. I turned the page and felt a cold chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the diner's air conditioning. It was a loan application. A high-risk, short-term loan from a lender that operated out of the back of a pawn shop in the bad part of town. The collateral listed was my property, my home, the house I built with my own 2 hands, the house where I raised him. The value was listed at $1.5 million. Frank leaned in, lowering his voice. He told me the plan. Preston needed that money not to pay back his investors, but to run. He had a flight booked for Mexico City on Saturday morning, one way. He and Tiffany were going to take the cash, leave the country, and leave the ruin behind them. They were going to vanish, leaving me and hundreds of other victims to pick up the pieces. But the knife went deeper. There was one last document in the folder. It was a glossy brochure for a place called Shady Oaks. The name sounded pleasant enough, but I knew the place. It was a state-funded facility 2 counties over. It was the kind of place you sent people when you wanted them to be forgotten. It was understaffed, underfunded, and smelled of urine and despair. It was a warehouse for the dying. Paper-clipped to the brochure was an admission form. It was already filled out. Name of resident, Henry Sterling. Reason for admission, advanced dementia and inability to care for self. Signature of guardian, Preston Sterling. The date of admission was set for this Friday afternoon. I stared at the paper. The letters swam before my eyes. Friday. That was 2 days away. The plan was simple and demonic. He would force me to sign the power of attorney on Friday morning, claiming it was for insurance or taxes. He would use that signature to sign the house over to the loan sharks. He would take the money. Then, he would drop me off at Shady Oaks, claim I was senile, and drive straight to the airport. He was going to sell his father into a living hell so he could sip margaritas on a beach with stolen money. I felt a tear slide down my cheek. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of pure, molten rage. I had spent my life protecting that boy. I had sanded down the sharp edges of the world so he would not get hurt. I had worked double shifts so he could have the education I never had. And this was his repayment. He did not just want my money. He wanted to erase me. He wanted to discard me like a broken tool that was no longer useful. Frank reached out and put a hand on my shoulder. He asked me what I wanted to do. He said we could go to the police right now. We could hand this file over to the feds and have him arrested before dinner. I closed the folder. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet diner. I told Frank no. The police would take too long. The law was clumsy. If we went to the police now, Preston might get wind of it. He might run early. He might destroy evidence. Or worse, he might manipulate the situation, claim I was the one who was confused, drag this out in court while he drained my accounts. Number 1. I had a better idea. I had a partner now. A partner who knew about money, about laws, and about sharks. I had B. I looked at Frank and thanked him. I pulled out a roll of cash from my pocket, money I had saved for a fishing trip that would never happen, and placed it on the table. Frank tried to push it back, but I insisted. I told him he had just saved my life. I walked out of the diner and into the blinding sunlight. The world looked different now. The colors were sharper. The noise of the traffic sounded like a battle drum. I was no longer a victim. I was a man with a dossier. I was a man with the truth in his hands. I got into my truck and threw the envelope onto the passenger seat. I looked at it one last time. That file was the death certificate of the relationship I thought I had with my son. Preston Sterling, The boy I taught to ride a bike was dead. The man who wore his face was a monster. And come Friday, I was going to introduce that monster to the only thing scarier than the FBI. I was going to introduce him to his stepmother. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life. I checked my watch. 48 hours. I had 48 hours to prepare the stage for the final act. I drove home, not with the heavy heart of a betrayed father, but with the cold calculation of a general going to war. I needed to show B the file. I needed to tell her that she was right. And then we needed to get ready for the signing. If Preston wanted a signature, I would give him one. But it wouldn't be on a power of attorney. It would be on his warrant. Friday evening arrived with the weight of a funeral procession. The air in the living room was thick, stagnant, and smelled of the cheap cologne worn by the two strangers my son had invited into our sanctuary. They called themselves a lawyer and a notary, but I know timber when I see it, and I know rot when I smell it. These men were not officers of the court. They were vultures in polyester suits circling a dying animal, waiting for the final breath so they could pick the bones clean. Preston moved with a nervous, manic energy that made my skin crawl. He walked to the front door, the heavy oak entrance I had installed 30 years ago to keep my family safe, and he turned the deadbolt. The click of the lock echoed through the house like a gunshot. He did not just lock the world out. He locked us in. He turned around, his eyes wide and feverish, and gestured toward the dining table. "Sit down, Dad," he said. His voice was tight, strained. "Let us get this over with so you can rest. You look tired." Tiffany was right behind me, her hands on my shoulders. It was not a comforting touch. Her fingers dug into my trapezius muscles, pushing me down, guiding me like a prisoner to the electric chair. I sat in the chair at the head of the table. I ran my hand along the edge of the wood. It was white oak, solid and unyielding. I remembered the day I built this table. I remembered planing the surface until it was as smooth as glass, imagining the Thanksgiving dinners and the birthday parties we would have here. I never imagined it would be the surface upon which my own son would sign away my life. The lawyer, a man with grease stains on his tie and eyes that refused to meet mine, slid a stack of documents across the wood. The paper was thick, creamy, and official. "Just some standard insurance forms, Henry," the lawyer mumbled, finally looking at me with a gaze that held zero empathy. "We just need to update your policy beneficiaries and ensure your medical coverage is active for the, transition." Preston leaned over my shoulder, his breath hot against my ear. "It is for your own good, Dad. You know how confusing these things get. The insurance company needs your signature to cover the costs of the new facility. We just want to make sure you are taken care of." I looked down at the papers. They thought I was blind. They thought the old man could not read without his glasses, or that my mind was too fogged by age to comprehend the legal jargon. But adrenaline is a powerful drug. It cleared the fog. It sharpened my vision. The words on the page screamed at me. Power of attorney. Irrevocable transfer of deed. Liquidation of assets. There was no insurance policy. There was no medical coverage. This was a slaughter. They were asking me to sign a document that gave Preston complete, unchecked control over everything I owned. My bank accounts, my truck, my tools, and this house. The moment the ink dried on this page, I would be a ghost in my own life. I would be destitute, homeless, and entirely at his mercy. And I knew exactly how much mercy my son had. None. I looked up at B. She was sitting quietly in the corner, her hands folded in her lap. To Preston and Tiffany, she looked like a frightened old servant waiting for instructions. But I saw her eyes. They were focused, intense, locking on to mine. She gave me a nearly imperceptible nod. It was the signal. Hold the line. I picked up the pen. It was a heavy, expensive fountain pen that Preston had bought for himself with my money. My hand began to tremble. I let it shake. I wanted them to see the weakness. I wanted them to taste the victory before I snatched it away. "Poor thing," Tiffany whispered, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Look at him, Preston. He can barely hold a pen. It is really time for him to go to the home. He is falling apart." "Just sign right there, Dad," Preston urged, tapping the signature line aggressively. "Right there. Then you can go to sleep." I brought the pen tip to the paper. I watched Preston's face. He was smiling. It was a greedy, ugly smile, the smile of a man who thinks he has gotten away with murder. He was already spending the money in his head. He was already on a beach in Mexico. He was already celebrating my demise. The trembling in my hands stopped. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the air of the house I built. I tightened my grip on the pen until my knuckles turned white. I was not Henry the victim. I was not Henry the invalid. I was Henry Sterling, master carpenter, and I knew how to drive a nail. With a primal grunt of exertion, I raised my arm and brought the pen down. I did not sign. I stabbed. The metal tip of the pen tore through the thick stack of papers, punching through the lies, through the betrayal, and drove deep into the solid oak of the table beneath. The sound was a dull, heavy thud that silenced the room. The pen stood there, quivering like an arrow hitting its target, burying the documents into the wood. Preston jumped back, his smile vanishing instantly. The lawyer gasped. I looked up, my eyes locking onto my son's terrified face. My voice was low, steady, and rumbled like thunder on the horizon. "I would rather burn this house to the ground, plank by plank, than let a single finger of your greedy hand touch it." The silence that followed was absolute. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then, the mask of the loving son shattered completely. Preston's face twisted into a snarl of pure, unadulterated rage. The veins in his neck bulged. His eyes went black. "You senile old bat!" he screamed, spit flying from his mouth. He lunged across the table, his hands reaching for my throat. The pretense was over. There was no more insurance, no more doctors, no more fake concern. There was only violence. He was going to take what he wanted, even if he had to break me to get it. I did not flinch. I did not pull back. I sat there, staring him down, ready to meet the storm. Because I knew something he didn't. I knew that the storm wasn't coming from me. It was coming from the corner of the room, where the woman he called a peasant was slowly, calmly standing up. The room was vibrating with the energy of imminent violence. My son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had taught to fish, stood over me with a fist raised like a hammer. His face was a mask of contorted rage, unrecognizable, twisted by greed and the desperation of a cornered animal. I did not flinch. I did not close my eyes. I looked straight into the abyss of his pupils, ready to take the blow. I had taken hits from life before. I had taken hits from falling timber and swinging steel. A punch from a coward would not break me. But the blow never landed. "Sit down, Preston." The voice did not come from me. It did not come from the trembling lawyer or the gasping notary. It came from the corner of the room, from the shadows where the woman they had mocked and belittled had been sitting. It was not the voice of B, the gentle gardener who hummed to her hydrangeas. It was a command. It was a voice of absolute, unquestionable authority, the kind that stops armies in their tracks. Preston froze, his fist hovering in the air. He turned his head slowly, confusion warring with his anger. "What did you say to me, you old hag?" he spat, trying to regain his momentum. B stood up. She did not struggle to her feet. She rose with a fluid, terrifying grace. She smoothed the front of her simple cardigan, but the gesture looked less like tidying up and more like a warrior checking their armor. She walked toward the light of the chandelier, and for the first time, Preston really saw her. He saw the steel in her spine. He saw the cold, calculating intelligence in her eyes that burned brighter than any diamond Tiffany had ever demanded. "I said sit down," B repeated, her voice dropping an octave, resonating with a power that seemed to shake the very floorboards. "Or would you prefer to be put down?" Before Preston could laugh, before he could utter another insult, B raised her hands and clapped 3 times. Sharp, rhythmic, decisive. The sound was like a trigger. The front door of my house, the heavy oak door that Preston had locked to trap us, exploded inward. It did not just open. It was breached. Wood splinters flew across the hallway as a battering ram hit the lock. The room was instantly flooded with motion. 6 men poured into the living room. They were not local cops. They were clad in tactical black gear, wearing body armor that looked expensive and serious. They moved with the silent, lethal efficiency of a wolf pack. On their chests, embroidered in silver thread, was a logo I did not recognize. But the word security was clear enough. "On the ground, now!" one of the men roared, his voice leaving no room for argument. Preston stumbled back, tripping over his own feet. The dirty lawyer dropped his briefcase, spilling papers everywhere, and threw his hands up so fast I thought he would dislocate his shoulders. Tiffany screamed, a high-pitched, piercing sound, and scrambled behind the sofa, clutching a throw pillow as if it could save her. 2 of the security officers had Preston pinned against the wall before he could take a breath. Another had the lawyer face down on my rug. The room, which had been a prison a moment ago, was now a command center. Then, through the shattered doorway, 2 more figures entered. The first I recognized immediately. It was Chief Miller, the head of the Oak Park Police Department. We played poker together on the 3rd Thursday of every month. He looked at me, gave a brief, apologetic nod, and then turned his stern gaze to my son. The second man was a stranger, but he radiated wealth. He wore a suit that probably cost more than my truck. He carried a leather attaché case and walked with the air of a man who billed by the minute. He walked straight to B and bowed his head slightly. "Mrs. Sterling," the man said, "the perimeter is secure. The local authorities have been briefed." "Thank you, Arthur," B said calmly. She did not look surprised. She looked bored. Preston, pressed against the wall with his cheek squashed against the plaster, managed to choke out a few words. "Chief Miller, what is going on? Help me! This woman is crazy. She hired mercenaries. Arrest her!" Chief Miller stepped forward, adjusting his belt. He looked at Preston with a mixture of pity and disgust. "I am not here to arrest her, Preston. I am here to ensure the safety of a high-profile citizen and to execute a federal warrant." B walked over to the dining table. She picked up the pen I had stabbed into the wood. She pulled it out with a single, sharp tug and tossed it onto the floor. Then, she took the folder Arthur handed to her. She threw it onto the table. It landed with a heavy slap right on top of the fake insurance papers. "Let us clarify the situation," Bea said, her voice cutting through the whimpers coming from Tiffany behind the sofa. She looked at the lawyer on the floor. "Get him up. I want him to hear this." The security guard hauled the lawyer to his feet. "You are disbarred as of this morning, Mr. Jenkins," Bea said, not even looking at him. "The ethics committee received a very interesting package of recordings an hour ago. You will be lucky if you only lose your license and not your freedom. Get him out of my sight." The guards dragged the weeping lawyer out the door. Bea turned her eyes to Tiffany. "And you," she said softly. Tiffany peeked out from behind the sofa, her mascara running down her cheeks. "You complained about the smell of this house. You complained about the furniture. You treated a man who built a life for his family like he was a burden." Bea signaled to Arthur. The man pulled a document from his case. "We have video evidence of you tampering with Mr. Sterling's medication, throwing away his personal property, and verbal abuse," Arthur recited in a monotone voice. "That constitutes elder abuse, a felony in this state. But we also have the medical report from the doctor you bribed. He flipped on you, Mrs. Sterling. He admitted there is no pregnancy. There never was. It was a coercion tactic." "Henry," Bea said, looking at me, "did you hear that? There is no grandchild. It was just another lie to get you to sign." My heart broke and healed in the same second. I wasn't going to be a grandfather, but I also wasn't going to be a victim of their trap. I looked at Tiffany. She looked small, pathetic. "And finally," Bea said, turning to face Preston. The guards spun him around so he had to look at her. My son was shaking. He was sweating so profusely his shirt was clinging to his chest. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "You were just a gardener. Dad picked you up at a community center." Bea smiled. It was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I am a gardener," she said. "I like to prune dead branches so the tree can survive. But before I retired to my garden, I was the CEO of Beatrice International Holdings." Preston's eyes went wide. The name meant something to him. Even I had heard of it. It was a conglomerate, a massive entity that owned real estate, shipping, and financial debt. "I looked at your portfolio, Preston," Bea continued, picking up a piece of paper from the file. "It is a disaster. You are not just broke. You are in a hole so deep you can see the magma. You owe money to investors. You owe money to banks. And you owe a significant amount to a private lending firm called Cerberus Capital." Preston turned pale. That is private. How do you know that?" "Because I bought Cerberus Capital this morning," Bea said casually, as if she were saying she bought a loaf of bread. The silence in the room was deafening. "I own your debt, Preston," she said, leaning in close to his face. "Every cent, every IOU, every reckless gamble you made, I own it all. Which means I own you." She stood back and looked at Arthur. "Execute the foreclosure on his penthouse," she ordered. "Freeze his offshore accounts, and hand the evidence regarding the Ponzi scheme over to the FBI agents waiting outside." "FBI?" Preston squeaked. Bea nodded. "They have been building a case, but they needed the final piece of the puzzle. I gave it to them. I gave them the ledger you were hiding in your golf bag." Preston's knees gave out. If the guards hadn't been holding him, he would have collapsed. He looked at me, tears streaming down his face. Dad, Dad, please. You can't let her do this. I am your son. Tell her to stop. Dad, please. I looked at him. I looked at the man who had mocked my wife, who had tried to steal my home, who had planned to throw me into a dying house. I looked at the man who had tried to gaslight me into thinking I was insane. I stood up slowly. My legs were steady. I walked over to Bea and took her hand. It was warm and strong. I do not have a son, I said, my voice calm and final. My son died the day he decided his father was just an asset to be liquidated. I turned to Chief Miller. Get them out of my house, Chief. They are trespassing. Preston screamed as they dragged him out. Tiffany wailed as she was handcuffed. But I did not watch them go. I was looking at my wife. I was looking at the woman who had hidden her crown to live a simple life with me, but who had put it back on the moment I needed protection. She looked tired. The adrenaline was fading. She looked at me, a question in her eyes, wondering if I was angry about the deception, wondering if I was afraid of who she really was. I lifted her hand to my lips and kissed her knuckles. Remind me, I said softly, never to make you angry about the laundry. Bea let out a laugh, a real, genuine laugh that broke the tension in the room. She squeezed my hand. The house was quiet again. The door was broken. The table was scarred. But the rot was gone. We were alone, but for the first time in a long time, we were safe. And I knew, as I looked at the carnage of legal papers on the floor, that the rebuilding could finally begin. Not the house. The house was fine. But the life. Our life. I stood on the front porch and watched the red and blue lights of the police cruisers painting the neighborhood in a chaotic, silent rhythm. The neighbors had gathered on their lawns, their faces illuminated by the flashing strobes, whispering behind their hands. It was the kind of spectacle that would fuel the gossip mill of Oak Park for a decade. But for me, it was just the closing of a heavy, rusted door. The front door opened, and two officers escorted Tiffany out first. The handcuffs behind her back forced her to walk with a strange, forward-leaning gait, stripping away every ounce of the supermodel arrogance she had worn like armor for years. She was not crying anymore. She was screaming. Her voice was shrill, cutting through the night air like a buzzsaw hitting a nail. It was his idea. I did not want to do it. Preston made me do it. He told me the old man was senile. I am a victim here. She twisted her head, looking for anyone who would listen, her eyes wild with panic. She spotted Bea standing next to me. You did this, you witch. The officer gently but firmly guided her into the back of the squad car, cutting off her venom mid-sentence. Then came Preston. He walked out with his head down, flanked by two federal agents. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. The expensive suit was rumpled, his tie was askew, and the confidence that had defined him was gone, replaced by a trembling, pathetic fear. As they reached the bottom of the steps, he looked up and locked eyes with me. Dad. The word hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Dad, please. You cannot let them take me. I am your son. It was just a mistake. We can fix this. Talk to her. Tell her to drop the charges. Dad. I looked at him. I searched my heart for that familiar pang of fatherly instinct, the urge to protect, to fix, to forgive. I waited for it to rise up and demand that I intervene. But there was nothing. Just a quiet, hollow silence. The man standing there was not the boy I taught to ride a bike. He was a stranger who had looked me in the eye and tried to sign my life away. He was a predator who had seen his father as prey. I did not say a word. I did not nod. I simply turned my back to him. I faced the woman standing beside me, the woman who had saved my life. Behind me, I heard the car door slam shut, a sound final and absolute, like a judge's gavel. As the sirens faded into the distance, taking the toxicity out of my life, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I had not realized I was carrying. 1 month later, the air on the porch tasted sweeter. It smelled of freshly cut grass and early autumn leaves, not deception. I sat in my rocking chair, a mug of hot tea in my hands, watching the "Sold" sign swinging gently in the breeze at the end of the driveway. B sat next to me, knitting a scarf that was definitely not made of gray wool this time, but a vibrant, fiery red. She stopped her needles and looked at me, a shadow of hesitation crossing her face. "Henry," she said softly, "I need to ask you something. Are you angry that I didn't tell you? About the money? About who I really was?" I took a sip of tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest. I looked at this woman, this billionaire CEO who had spent months on her knees in the dirt helping me weed my garden, who had endured insults and ridicule just to be near me. "B," I said, setting the mug down on the railing. "When we met, you were wearing a stained apron and you had dirt under your fingernails. You told me the best way to save a dying rose bush was patience and eggshells." I reached over and took her hand, feeling the strength in her fingers. I did not marry a bank account. I did not marry a corporation. I married the woman who knows how to care for living things. I married the woman who saw an old, lonely carpenter and decided he was worth her time. The money is yours. The heart is mine. And that is the only deal I care about. B smiled, and for the first time, I saw a tear slip down her cheek. She squeezed my hand. "Good," she whispered, "because I bought us something, and I think you are going to need your tools." She pointed toward the driveway. I stood up and looked. Pulling up to the curb was not a limousine. It was a beast. It was a 40-foot, top-of-the-line recreational vehicle, a land yacht that shimmered in the sunlight. It had slide-outs, solar panels, and enough storage for a full workshop. I turned to her, my jaw dropping. "You said you always wanted to see the Grand Canyon," she said, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "And I am tired of boardrooms. I want to see the world from the passenger seat, with you driving." I looked back at the house. My house. The house I had built with my own hands. It was empty now. The furniture was gone. The memories, both good and bad, were soaked into the walls. But they did not own me anymore. I had sold it yesterday. But I did not keep the money. I remembered the look on the face of the director of the Silver Oaks Foundation when I handed in the check. It was the full sale price of the house. Every penny. The money Preston had tried to steal was now going to build a new wing for indigent seniors. A place where people like me would be treated with dignity, not discarded like trash. It was the ultimate poetic justice. My son wanted to put me in a warehouse for the dying. I used his inheritance to build a sanctuary for the living. I walked down the steps, my boots crunching on the gravel one last time. I ran my hand along the side of the RV. It felt solid. It felt like an adventure. I went to the back, opened the storage compartment, and tossed my old toolbox inside. The clatter of wrenches and hammers was the only music I needed. "Are you ready, Henry?" Bee called out from the passenger window. She had already climbed in and was adjusting the mirrors. I climbed into the driver's seat. The leather was soft. The dashboard looked like the cockpit of a jet, but the steering wheel felt right in my hands. I looked up at the rearview mirror. I could see the house one last time. It looked small from here. It was just wood and brick. It was just a building. My home was sitting right next to me. I turned the key. The engine roared to life, a deep, powerful rumble that vibrated through the chassis. I put the gear in drive and released the parking brake. "I am ready," I said. We pulled away from the curb, leaving the "sold" sign and the ghosts of the past behind us. I did not look back. I kept my eyes on the horizon, where the road stretched out endlessly, full of twists and turns and mountains we had yet to climb. I was 70 years old. I had no house. I had no son. But as I merged onto the highway, holding the hand of the woman I loved, I realized I was the richest man in the world. I was free. This story taught me a lesson that I want to share with you. Blood makes you related, but loyalty makes you family. We often spend our lives trying to build inheritances for children who do not respect the sacrifice it took to earn them. We tolerate disrespect because we think we have to, because we are afraid of being alone. But my son showed me that greed can turn even the closest kin into a stranger. True wealth is not the house you own or the balance in your bank account. True wealth is having a partner who stands by you when the world attacks, and having the courage to cut off the toxic roots in your life so you can finally bloom. Don't be afraid to start over, no matter how old you are. Your dignity is worth more than any legacy. If this story touched your heart or gave you the courage to set boundaries in your own life, please hit the like button. It helps more people find this message. Subscribe to the channel for more stories about justice and resilience. And let me know in the comments, have you ever had to make a tough choice between family and your own peace? I read every single comment. See you on the next road.